Let's talk about this one. David asks a theological question, good question. In his earthly ministry, was Jesus capable of sin? Wouldn't being fully man require the possibility of sin? And how can it be called temptation if there was no possibility to sin present? This is a classic question and a great question. And the problem with us just easily answering it is because we have a very unique person in Jesus Christ. The Bible is very clear that Jesus is the second person of the eternal Godhead. He is one essence with God, and yet he has put on humanity. Very strange for us to even consider. It's called the hypostatic union, where we have two natures fully represented in Christ. They're not commingled, they're not confused, and they are the reality of what we know here in the Scriptures of a God-man, the God-man Jesus Christ. Now, you look at statements about God in the Bible. God cannot be tempted by evil. James chapter 1, that's clear. So he's not tempted. He's not sitting there wondering if, he should sin. And yet in humanity, we know that, and we hear about the facts in Hebrews that he is tempted as we are in every respect, yet without sin. So we try to figure out this question just by simply answering the question, really with one mindset on, that as God, of course, he could not sin, right? And as a human being, right, as someone representing humanity and participating fully in humanity, well, then, of course, he can be tempted. But what does that mean? Well, he's the God-man, Jesus Christ, and therefore, maybe a good way to answer this is that he could not sin because even in his humanity, he would not sin. And that's the whole point, right? Jesus comes as the second Adam, it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and he accomplishes for us what Adam didn't. Adam fell into sin and temptation, and Christ was tempted in all areas, and yet he did not sin. So in his humanity, right, it took all of the issues that we have to go through in exercising the muscle of resolving to do what is right and righteous, to be trained in righteousness as Jesus was, as the book of Hebrews says. And there was real training, there was real effort, there was real struggle, there was real pain, and all of that is true in his humanity. In his divinity, though, of course, he is not capable of sin. And so the answer, David, is always going to be unsatisfying in that regard, because we sense that it's a bit of a cop-out to say he was tempted because we know that in his divinity he could not sin. But the reality is, in his humanity, he had to exercise all that we have to exercise, and he did it in a way that Adam didn't and that we didn't, and that is that he conquered the temptation and was doing it with one hand tied behind his back, in the sense that he went out into the wilderness. If you think about Matthew chapter 4, and he went out, Luke chapter 4 records the same situation. He's hungry, he's fasting, and he's tempted in his humanity based on urges and temptations in his stomach to turn rocks into bread, and yet he doesn't do that. He resists that. Now, he has to sleep every night. Think about that. Every night, as a human being, he has to sleep. And in that, let's just say he was going to stay up and pray. He has to fight what Peter, James, and John in the Garden of Gethsemane didn't successfully fight. They were falling asleep. Jesus fought the human pang of wanting to sleep, and he fought through that temptation to do what he had resolved to do. And in that regard, we think about God, who says very clearly he doesn't sleep, he doesn't slumber, he never goes to sleep. So in divinity, of course, right, we say, well, it's impossible to sleep. As a human, you sleep every night. And could Jesus have slept when he wanted to pray? Well, he could have, and in his humanity, he could have sinned. But, of course, he is producing through the human experience of temptation, whether it's praying instead of sleeping, as the Peter, James, and John failed to do in the Garden of Gethsemane, or it is, saying no to whatever the temptation might be. And whatever shortcuts to righteousness that Satan presented him, he wasn't willing to take any of those. So I don't think we should diminish the human pain of saying no to sin, the human deprivation of not fulfilling the impulses that you might have. And Jesus clearly exercised all of that muscle. So I don't think you're going to get before Christ and say, hey, Christ, you really didn't suffer very much in your temptation, because it was impossible for you to sin. I don't think anyone's going to dare say that to Christ, and I think maybe we'll have a much more full understanding of that experience of existing in the hypostatic union of two natures in one person. That is really hard for us now, but 1 John 3 gives us some hope that we'll have the mind of Christ one day, and we look forward to our glorification when maybe these theological issues won't bother us